What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you end up enjoying this video, doing any of those helps the video to do well and the channel to do well, and ensures I can continue making this content daily for many years to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the video, please be sure to share them in the comments below, as I always read all of them, even if I don't always get the chance to respond to them all. Last but not least, if you guys would like to support the channel further than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and all that, please be sure to check out the join button somewhere around the subscribe button. If you click on that, it will let you join the channel membership for as low as $2 a month, and you get special access to emoticons you can use when you comment, and special icons that appear next to your name as well. No content will ever be locked behind the paywall, it's just something extra you can do if you'd like to support the channel further. Without further ado though guys, we'll get right into the stories, and I hope you guys enjoy them. Have a great day. My brother was a real jerk. Growing up, I liked animals quite a lot, and a lot of times just to spite me, he would always be an ass to them. I once had a cat. He would take it and throw it into the laundry dryer, then turn it on for a minute. He would open the door and the cat would bolt out in a panic. He would also put it into a bucket, hold it in there, and hang the bucket from a tree branch. He would then pull the branch down and launch the cat into the air like a catapult. The cat would do several somersaults before luckily landing on its feet and running away. He would do all kinds of dreadful things, then laugh at me when I cried and tried to get him to stop. The worst thing my brother ever did to an animal, though, happened late one summer night. Our parents were out of town, and he happened to be watching me. Our other brother, as much of a jerk as he was, did let us stay up late at least. That was pretty nice. We had a nice house in the country, and it was nice to stay up late in the summer. On the first night my parents were away, around midnight we heard this barking and growling out in our front yard. Obviously, some dog was out there. I looked out the window and saw a ragged husky standing just off our front porch. The poor thing looked like it had been through hell. It was dirty, had patches of hair missing in places, and may have even been sick. We ignored it for the most part, because dogs in the yard were not an unusual thing. Eventually, it left all on its own. The following night, we heard the dog barking again. I looked out the window only to see it was the same old husky. It was odd that the dog had come back around the same time, but we didn't really give it too much mind. Again, dogs in the yard were not an unusual thing. After a while, it left once more. We heard the dog barking again around midnight the following night. As I had done the previous nights before, I checked out the window and saw it was the same husky. I told my brother I was a bit scared this dog kept on coming back. Well, as you might imagine, telling him that was a mistake. Letting my brother know you're scared is never a smart thing to do. He began to make fun of me, teasing me that the dog was going to get into the house and eat me. Occasionally, he would go to open the door and taunt like he was going to let the dog into the house. My other brother and I would cringe and scream for him to close it right now. He would, but our fear just made him tease us even more. At one point that night, my brother grabbed my cat and tormented me by grabbing it and threatening to throw it out the door so the dog could kill it. While I was crying and begging him to stop, he opened the door just a bit. He was shocked to see the husky was right there. It began to bark and growl at him and startled him greatly. The cat freaked out and clawed the hell out of my brother's hand. It got loose and immediately ran in the opposite direction. My brother was pissed off now, but he couldn't take it out on the cat. Instead, he decided to take it out on the dog. Fair warning, there's some animal cruelty here and it's quite graphic. The most traumatizing thing I've ever experienced in my life happened next. My brother ran into our parents' room and grabbed my dad's shotgun. We begged him not to, but his hand was bleeding from being clawed at, and he was angry. He took the gun and sprinted outside, slamming the door in our faces. Then, right in front of our eyes, as we looked out the window, We saw our brother shoot and kill that husky. All we could do was scream and cry. My brother came back in and dragged us out into the dark with him. He made us grab shovels and made us go and bury that dead husky. It was terrible. The shotgun blast had torn the poor thing to shreds. It was traumatizing to see an animal looking like that. It was past midnight now and hot outside. We lived way out in the country. We were both in shock from what we'd just seen, and here we were digging a grave for a poor animal who hadn't done anything wrong other than come to our yard. It took 2 hours, but finally we got it buried rather deep. The next day was absolute hell. My other brother and I tried to brush off the entire incident as if it were nothing. I had never known anyone who could care so little for the life of an innocent creature as my brother did. After that dreadful day, we were trying to watch some movies later at night to get our minds after what happened. As midnight approached, I heard the scariest thing I'd ever heard in my life. I heard the exact same bark as we'd put up with the past 3 nights in our front yard. My older brother looked really shocked, but it was nothing compared to how he looked when he got up and glanced out the living room window. He turned completely white and his jaw fell open. I moved up to get a look out the window with him, but he told me to sit back down. He closed the drapes and ran over to the front door and locked it. He came back over to the couch and sat down with the 2 of us. He kept on looking at that window until the barking eventually stopped. And that was the last night we ever heard the barking. My brother went and dug up the grave of the husky after, but never told us whether the dog was still buried or not. I'm not 100% sure what really happened that night, but I will tell you one thing. My brother was never cruel to an animal after. So I work at a pizza place, usually inside, as my insurance does not cover claims when driving for business. Occasionally, though, I'll cover a delivery shift for one of the drivers because the money is very good. Our delivery area includes a few new development upper middle class cookie cutter neighborhoods, usually bad tips. An older 1940s era village, average tips, 2 apartment complexes where you get great tips, and some trailer parks where you might get no tips. There's also a few rural areas. Not rural or anything to the point where you could see all the stars at night, but enough that you couldn't hear your neighbors yelling or anything. About a week ago, I was covering a delivery shift. I come back to the shop feeling pretty good. I was averaging $5 a delivery, and they'd all been pretty close by. I checked to see if I had any more on the list. I had one to this address I had never seen before. We usually only got semi-regulars as deliveries, so an address that I wasn't the least bit familiar with was quite odd. It was out on one of the more rural roads. I asked the kid who'd taken the order what was up, because there were special instructions on the ticket as well. They said to go around back because the front door doesn't work. Okay, that's not that uncommon, I suppose. People often want you to go around back. Either they just painted the door or the house is shifted and it's a shift to open or something. Maybe they're just hanging out back with their friends. As I'm driving out to the house though, I started to get an odd feeling. I didn't really like the idea of going to the back of some house way out here in the sticks. It would be all too easy for some thugs to order a pizza to an abandoned house and then jump the delivery guy. There were quite a few in the more rural areas. I figured I'd just scope the place out when I got there, and if it seemed sketchy, I'd just call them and make up some bull about how it was against company policy to go around the back of houses to prevent robberies. As I was driving further, I realized it was toward the end of this road that got less and less populated the further down you went. Great. I was getting pretty near the address now, driving slower. All of a sudden, I see this house, completely abandoned looking, set back from the roads with no address on it, in the middle of a bunch of trees. I think to myself, that better not be the f***ing house. I drove past and checked the next house's address. Lo and behold, that abandoned-looking house was the right one. At this point, I was not super worried though. Out in the boonies, the standards of upkeep on your house are pretty low, so a house in disrepair isn't that unusual. I double back over to this house and pull into the driveway. I was getting really bad vibes. Something was not right here. I parked my car at the very end of the driveway, with the rear on the shoulder so anyone passing by could clearly see it. At this point, I called back to the shop and told them this was quite sketchy. If I didn't call back in 4 or 5 minutes, call me, and if I didn't answer, call the cops right away. While I was calling in, I took a chance to take a better look at the house. It looked extremely abandoned, not just in disrepair. The driveway was crumbling, bits of gravel and weeds were growing out of it. There was no mailbox either. No trash cans, no car, no lawnmowers, no landscaping. Absolutely nothing to indicate anyone lived here. It looked like the yard hadn't been mowed in years, almost like a jungle. The house was total crap as well. The roof was falling apart, the siding was falling apart, the back deck which came around the side was falling apart too. The only part of the house, in fact, that looked even a little bit decent was the allegedly non-functioning front door. The windows were all completely shut. Well, the few that weren't boarded up at least. I didn't see any wires running to this house either. It was not dark, but it was dusk. Not a single sign of light in the house. I was getting pretty nervous at this point. I'm a 5'10" male, 180 pounds. Not in particularly great shape, but I did take karate for 10 years. I'm not completely helpless, but I avoid any sort of fights if I can. I'm mostly a pacifist anyway. I would rather not get robbed, but I was mostly worried about getting jumped and killed. It was a fairly safe area, but recently there had been some unsavory people moving in from the city. A big spike in home invasions and robberies. More worrying, a few stabbings and assaults as well. Now it was either time to nut up or shut up. I was not going to just go charging in there like a fool though. I got out my phone and called the number they'd given when ordering. While doing so, I got the pizza out as well and made sure to leave my door open. A running car half in the road and an abandoned house with the door open looked suspicious, right? I figured if any shit went down, it might look out of place enough to make someone stop. Not that there's any real traffic this far down this road. I was starting to walk up to the house while the phone was ringing. Rings twice, then an automated message comes on. It said something along the lines that this phone number was associated with an internet texting app. I think Haywire perhaps. This was a huge red flag. My heart was pounding in my throat. Everything was telling me to bail. I didn't want to get a reputation for being a flaky driver though and lose all future delivery shifts, which is why I had not bailed yet. I'm just standing there holding this pizza, looking at this haunted house or whatever, not wanting to venture around the back of it. I was hoping the resident would just look out the window and come out by the road to grab it. I'm looking at the front windows, checking for any sign of life. I see a blind go up on one of the windows next to the front door, and this really creepy guy, hat pulled low and big sunglasses, looking out at me. There was no reason for him to be wearing sunglasses when it was this dark. There also appeared to be a giant guy standing behind him in the room. It could have been anything, I suppose. When he saw me looking, he mouthed something and darted away, presumably toward the allegedly broken front door. At this point, I noped the fuck out. I had stayed pretty close to my car anyway, so it was only a few steps away. I jumped into the driver's seat, threw the pizza into the passengers, something I would never do since I'm really anal about keeping my car clean, and slammed it in reverse. Without looking, I simultaneously slammed and locked my door, floored it backwards onto the main road, and slipped my clutch horribly. At this point, I didn't care though. I didn't want to fuck around and risk a stall. I didn't even check for cross traffic. Really stupid on my part, I know. I started to drive away and looked back at the house. The screen door on the outside of the front door was now open, but the front was shut still. The guy wasn't out in the yard yelling, "Wait, come back," or anything like that. It seemed he had just disappeared. I pulled over a little ways up the road to call back to the shop and tell them I was all good. I'd elaborate fully when I got back. Those people never called back to inquire about their food or anything. Usually people would call if their pizza was just 15 minutes late, and these people never even got it. It was really strange they never said anything. Pretty much confirmed they were up to no good in my mind. After telling my coworkers about it, we concluded it was definitely a robbery at the very least. We put the address and phone number on our no deliveries list and ate their pizza ourselves. I doubt I would have gotten murdered or anything. Maybe robbed with a gun pulled out or a little roughing up, sure. It was still unnerving though. I could have easily gotten into some serious trouble just by doing my job, especially if those idiots had picked a slightly less abandoned house to set up at. When I was 18, I spent quite a lot of time in the Cohuta Wilderness. My favorite spot was this set of waterfalls several miles from the nearest parking area. Most visitors just parked in the RV area and swam in the creek right along the gravel road. In the 2 years I'd hiked all those trails, I had never seen anyone further than a half-mile in. Anyway, one Saturday, I took my girlfriend to see these beautiful waterfalls, since she had never had the opportunity to see one in person before. We set off along the trail, when not 15 minutes into our walk, she grabbed my arm and got real quiet. She told me she felt like she was being watched, and had those heebie-jeebies. I assured her that everything was safe. The only thing I'd ever had to worry about in this part of the woods were the occasional bear or maybe a copperhead. We continued on, but instead of leaving, the feeling of being watched just kept on getting worse and worse for her. I figured at first she just wasn't used to the wilderness yet and was having a bit of trouble adjusting. A couple of hours later, we finally reached the end of the trail and had a picnic at the bottom of the falls. After we finished eating, she tried to check her cell phone for messages, only to panic when she realized we had no service. I calmly explained to her that there was no cell reception anywhere around for miles. We were finally alone and could just enjoy some peace and solitude. This, of course, made her panic even worse. We decided to start heading back almost immediately. She was clearly scared, and I couldn't help but smile, thinking it was very silly. On the way back, I explained to her how many times I'd been out there all alone, and I'd never had any problems. Still though, she just couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. We were about a mile from the falls now, on the only trail around, when suddenly, we heard someone call out to us from behind. I nearly jumped out of my skin and turned to see a man walking towards us. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder and a heavy beard with his hat tipped low over his face. My girlfriend took a small step behind me. Hello, sir. What can I do for you?" I asked, trying to sound friendly.
"Oh, you guys left your cell phone back by the falls," he said,
a slight grin on his beard as he looked at my girlfriend. "Oh, thanks for the assist, buddy," I said, extending my hand. He shook his head. He told me he hadn't brought it with him. It was still sitting up there. Maybe we should follow him instead and come get it ourselves. We politely declined, of course, and made our way back down the trail as quickly as possible, him following us the entire way and trying to stay out of sight. I noticed that he'd followed us all the way back to our car even. She showed me her cell phone was still in her pocket when I opened her door. Ever since that, I didn't go back on that particular trail again. This story goes back a few years ago, when I was a 17-year-old high school student. Every day, I'd walk the 25 to 30-minute journey to and from school. There was this shortcut I could take home that would take some time off the walk, and as a nature lover, the shortcut was very enjoyable as well. Whenever I'd walk home, I would take this shortcut to enjoy the small amount of forest we have in this medium-sized, moderately busy city I live in. It was pretty well traveled, and I would occasionally see other people walking from their neighborhood toward the busy streets close by, or other students walking home from high school or college as well. Sometimes, though, there would be no one else but me on this path. To give you an idea, it was definitely not well groomed or anything, but it was traveled enough that you could make out a distinct path from being trampled over the years. It started off from the busy road by my high school, then went into a low-lying, open wooded area with some small ponds around. After a few minutes of this, I could veer right up the big hill towards the parallel street to my street, One day, I happened to be walking home from school after staying a bit late for some extra help. A few minutes into my shortcut, I noticed a guy sort of standing off the main path a bit, minding his own business seemingly while talking on a cell phone. There was an open backpack sitting on the ground by his feet. I suppose this wasn't unusual by any means, since the entire low-lying area was traveled, and there were numerous paths off the main path leading different directions. It wasn't really a thick forest or anything, so it was sort of like a free-for-all for people walking. Sometimes people would just stand off the busy road while waiting for the bus to come by or something, not wanting to stand in all the traffic fumes while people sped by during rush hour. The only thing I took distinct note of was that I had been seeing him there a few times that week, and I had never seen him before previously. Oh well though, maybe he was a new college student, or just moved into the area or something. This time, walking on that shortcut felt different though, possibly because there was no one else on the path with me today. I started to get this bad feeling in my stomach. Something was not right. I was already well along into the shortcut though. I decided to blame my feelings on just being paranoid. Not like I could do much about it at this point anyway. I kept an eye on the man as I walked past. He continued to talk on his cell phone and didn't seem suspicious in any way. I continued to go on and thought it must be nothing. I must have walked about 30 meters away when the man suddenly stopped talking on his phone. I got an even bigger feeling of dread in my gut. I turned around to see him crouched over, phone gone, fidgeting around with some sort of cloth and a brown glass bottle. Before I even had a second to register what the fuck this man was doing, his head shot up in my direction. The look on his eyes was a terrifying mix between "I've been caught" and "I can't stop now." He dropped everything, leaving his shit behind, and started sprinting right for me, cloth in his hand. At this point, I was too far away from the busy road for anyone to see me with this crazy f***, and I was too far away to scream bloody murder either. My first instinct in that split second was to run towards my neighborhood. I decided this all as I turned around, throwing my heavy backpack on the ground and sprinting as fast as I could, starting up the hill towards my neighborhood. Judging solely by appearance, this guy looked like he could break me in half with no effort. I trusted my flight response much more than fight in this moment. Plus, I didn't know what the fuck that could be in his hand. All throughout school, I had been top cross-country and track runner out of the female and male teams. My running had been my savior in a few other occasions, but soon into the chase, I knew it wasn't going to be enough this time. This guy was fast as shit. I could tell he was gaining on me without even having to look back. I finally saw some fenced-in yards up ahead and was hoping some people were home from work. I started trying to scream as much as I could with my out-of-breath and useless voice. I made the split decision to start jumping fences into people's yards, hoping this guy's hurdling skills were much happier than his running. It seemed like the first fence threw him off a bit, but by the second into the next yard he was right on my ass. I felt like he'd almost grabbed my leg. I was shitting myself at this point. No cars in driveways, no sign of anyone home. The only thing keeping me from panicking and wiping out in my exhausted state was thinking I may never see my family or friends again. The next yard, though, belonged to people I knew rather well, including their dog. With that next yard and my newly acquired friend in sight, I had never felt as much hope as I did in that moment. By some insane stroke of luck, they'd let their dog out in the backyard for the afternoon while they were at work. When Leo, the dog, saw me frantically running towards him, he started wagging his tail. Immediately after, he looked at the guy chasing close behind me, and he started going crazy. I thought this would be enough to get the guy to get the fuck off of me, but no, he started to jump over the fence just after I did. The dog jumped up though, and his teeth sank into the guy's face as that creep fell backwards into the other yard, straight onto his head. I fell into the dog's yard on mine as well. The creep and I stared at each other, out of breath for a few moments. The dog was barking and jumping like mad at the fence at him. Maybe he was assessing if he could take on Leo or not. I prayed the creep didn't have a knife or something. The guy looked angrier than I'd ever seen a person. After a few seconds, he got up and started running back down the hill from where we'd come. I sat there for a few seconds in complete shock. I couldn't move until my little hero started licking my face. I snapped out of it, ran to the back door, and started pounding. Obviously, they weren't home, or they would have probably heard what had just gone down. My house was close enough, thankfully, so I jumped the fence and ran the rest of the way home. Then I called the cops to investigate and try and find the guy. I gave them the best description I could after coming face to face with the man. The dude's bag was gone though, and so was every trace of them. They also found my poor knapsack in a muddy puddle, and the police told me they'd keep on looking. I never saw that guy again, and I didn't hear anything more about it. After calling the office a few more times, I gave up. They told me during that time they had received several sketchy reports, people being stalked, chased, nothing quite like mine though. Over the last few months, there were also a few missing persons cases. In a city like the one I'm from though, not the worst and not the best, you can never connect anything like that for sure. The more I thought about it over the years, the more fucked up it is, and the more confused I am. First of all, if he was trying to kidnap me, why didn't he think of a better way to grab and snatch into the forest before I had the chance to get away, or before another trail goer could have possibly walked by? He didn't appear to have a weapon or anything on him either, except for that creepy cloth. My friend thought it must have been chloroform. I did some research on it, and apparently it's more of a myth that pouring on a rag and covering a person's face causes them to faint quickly. It actually takes quite a long time. Plus, where the hell did he get it anyway? He didn't seem very prepared for his impromptu kidnapping. Thanks to that asshole though, I never walked that shortcut anymore, without at least 2 friends and some pepper spray or some sort of protection. I don't really know what I was thinking when I set up my classes and my living situation during my second year of college. My school had a huge campus, nearly 800 acres or so. I was a physics major, and I knew the building where all the physics classes were held. During my freshman year, I'd had to stay in a specific dorm which was built just for freshmen. This was in the middle of campus. As a sophomore, though, I could choose which building I wanted to stay in. I got into the honors dorm due to my 4.0 and chose to stay there for that year. It just so happened to also be on the far side away of campus from the building the physics classes were located in. The reason all of this is even relevant at all is I never took into account just how difficult it would be for me to get to my class and back to my dorm during the cold weather. Don't get me wrong, during the early fall and spring, it was really awesome to get all that exercise and get that good mood and the good weather. I lived in a very northern state though, and it tended to get absolutely frigid in the late fall and all throughout winter. I also liked to sleep in a lot, so I would take as many classes as I could in the evening. You can guess what this led to. In late November, I was in the dorm room watching the news, and the weather said we were supposed to be getting quite a bad snowstorm that evening. Although I really did love being in class, I was really hoping that this evening they would be canceled, and I could just spend the evening alone in my room instead. Checking out the college's website, I was upset to find that classes were canceled, but only in the morning and the following day. Evening classes were not. I trudged my way over to class as the snowflakes fell all around me. I wasn't too shocked to see there were not a whole lot of other students out there with me. We had a huge enrollment, but most likely most were going to blow off this class. It was a regular class I'd upgraded to an honors class, so I really couldn't afford to miss this one. Interestingly enough, most of the other physics students I hadn't seen on my way there. There weren't more than 10 in the entire classroom. I sat down in the front and got settled in for a nice 2-hour lecture. There were no windows in that classroom, so I had absolutely no idea just how bad the snow was falling. I did have a good idea I was going to get some wet feet once I got back to my room, though. Once the class ended, the other students filed out, but I stayed behind and asked the professor a few clarifying questions. Once I was done, he left to go back to his office, and I was pretty much left all alone. I walked over to the door and looked out the tiny window frame on it. What I saw disheartened me greatly. The snow was loose and already knee-deep. It was also currently falling really hard. Visibility was clear. It was going to be a pain in the ass and a long walk to get back to my room. I kept looking out the window, trying to muster up my courage, before I finally figured it wasn't going to get any better just standing here. Putting the collar of my coat up and pulling down my hat, I went outside. It sucked immediately. Not only was it much, much colder than it had been on the way there, but the snow was actually stinging me as it hit my skin. It was like hurting my eyes so much I had to shade them. This made my already weakened visibility even worse. I had incorrectly assumed the snow was falling loose, and that's why it had piled up so much. In actuality, it was very difficult to walk through such compact snow. I was pretty much all alone as well. As I walked further towards the center of campus, I finally saw one other person walking outside as well. Up ahead, just on the walkway, there was someone standing underneath a light post. I could only make out their shadow really, since it was so hard to see. Whoever this person was though, they'd obviously noticed me too, and gave me what looked to be a friendly wave. I felt a little bit relieved to not be out here in this state alone. The person, who I assume was a student, was motioning for me to catch up with them. The wind and snow was still stinging my eyes. It was going to take a bit of effort to catch them. They were standing in the direction I was walking anyway, though. As I got closer and closer, trying to make out their features, the very first thing I noticed was that whoever it was not very big and had what looked like long, curly hair. I figured this must be a girl or something. It looked like they were holding a purse, although it could have been a book bag as far as I knew. They kept on motioning for me to come closer and closer. This began to seem a little weird. As I squinted even further against the snow, I noticed that this mystery person was not standing there alone. There appeared to be a second person there, laying in the snow. I hadn't noticed at first because it was so deep. As soon as I saw that person, I put two and two together and realized why the shadow outline person kept on beckoning me. It seemed their friend must have fallen down in the snow and gotten hurt, and they needed my help to move them. Feeling mighty heroic, I began pushing harder and risking slipping myself when I actually heard the person on the ground call out for help. It seemed odd she was doing so. Her friend was literally right next to her. When I finally got close enough to make out the features of the person who was standing there, though, I realized just why that girl was screaming for help. The guy was wearing a dark trench coat, and the curly hair was from a pullover clown mask he was wearing. He was standing on the legs of the girl who was laying on the ground. Feeling even more heroic spirit, I thought I must try and help this girl right now. She was obviously being held down by this clown. Who knew what he was going to do? I was not very big, but she was obviously hurt, and this might be the only chance she had to get away. When the man saw my concern, though, he surprised me and started to back away a bit. He put his hands up as if to show me he was innocent. I walked over to the girl. When I put my hand out to help her up, she uncovered her head and turned to look at me. My heart skipped a beat when I saw she was also wearing a clown mask. She pulled a knife out from under herself and actually stabbed me in the leg. I fell backward into the snow. I watched as she hopped up off the ground. I tried to get up to move, but I had forgotten about the clown that had backed off. He had actually slipped around behind me and grabbed me roughly, pulling me to my feet. Once I was up, he held one of my arms behind my back. The other he wrapped around my chest. The girl clown was now fully up as well. She moved close to me through the snow. I struggled to try and throw the clown behind me off, but I couldn't get any leverage with this slippery ground. As the girl clown came closer to me with that knife, I did the only thing I could think to do in that moment. I clumsily kicked some snow at her. There was enough of it to throw her off guard for a moment, I suppose, but it didn't really do me any good. The male clown just gripped my arm even harder, and the girl clown quickly gained her composure back. She walked up to me again, brandishing the knife and holding it up. Once she was close enough, I could see her eyes. The female clown put the knife up against my face and pressed the tip into it. I yelped as it pierced my skin. She dragged the knife down, making a shallow cut on my cheek, and whispered in my ear, "Stevenson, 302. My door number." The clown behind me threw me onto the ground. I was worried about my face, sure, but I was happy he was about to let me go. As I was trying to stumble to my feet, I noticed them hurrying away. It didn't take long until both clowns were lost to the snow. Should I have felt relieved? Yeah, I really thought they were going to kill me. Did I feel relieved, though? No. They knew who I was, and they knew which room mine was, too. They were obviously willing to hurt me as well. Worst thing was, I had no idea who these people could be, what they looked like, or when I would see them again. Fortunately, housing let me change apartments immediately. I was pissed I had to leave the honors dorm, but a room had opened up next door to the science building at least. I never found out who those clowns were, and I have no idea if I ever saw them again without their disguises. They could have been anyone. They could have even had a class with me, and I would have never even known. This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I'm a USAF Security Forces airman, a military policeman basically. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick and I decided to go explore some back roads to get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used, but many more totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I had spent many a day starting off on roads that we knew, finding roads we didn't know, and driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over those mountains, we set off on a road we had never been on before and began our drive outward. After driving for around an hour or so, we hadn't seen nor heard any sign of any other people in these woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by aspen groves. This meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, no insect noise, no squirrels, certainly no other people either. On the other side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, we could see a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table you'd see in a park. Remarking on the strangeness of this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being very apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the area was very unsettling. It was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as the aspens grew extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5". Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were at my chest level. I would have had to climb up to even sit down. As I was looking over this weird thing, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed he was now glancing out into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at. Then, though, I noticed a splash of color, completely out of place in the thick trees. It was almost hidden away, a small one-man tent set back in the trees about 50 feet from this strange table. I had a feeling of dread and felt certain that someone must be in there. If we could see that tent, they could see us as well. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone this remote and trying to hide would at the very least be a strange person. As we observed the tent though, We didn't see any movement nor hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested I call out. I didn't want to, but I still did so anyway. "Hey, anyone in there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about just driving away and leaving this strange area. We began to fear the worst, though. What if there was a body in this tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped or something and they were hiding out here? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards this tent. I was totally keyed up, with my senses on full alert. As I reached the campsite hidden in the trees, several things struck me as odd immediately. I could see backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built, no wood collected. The tent was it was full of backpacks, and women's clothing as well. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had just seen. As I turned, though, I could hear Nick now yelling, "Come on, man, let's go. Let's get the fuck out of here." I didn't know why he was yelling now, but I ran back to the truck nonetheless. When I broke out of the trees, I could see a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from exiting. I leapt into the passenger seat, and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men, a third person laying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us in from the road. Nick barely managed to swerve around them and accelerated the way we had come from. I looked back, only to see the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road and follow. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing that car again. I don't know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police immediately, and they promised to send a trooper out to check the scene. I received a call the next day from a trooper, though, stating the campsite, the backpacks, and the women's clothing were all gone. He could tell people had been in the area, though. The strange table was still by the grove. I've not returned to that area since, and I don't intend to ever again. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are dirt poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, though, I'd absolutely have to move somewhere else. It's one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you get stuck there, without anything else going for you at least, excluding a handful of doctors, lawyers, and Georgia Power Company employees. The only employment in area is Walmart, fast food, and maybe if you're lucky working at a grocery store. To the east of my town, there's this massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy going on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's a 10-mile drive out from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for many miles. In the past, there had been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads as well. It was so bad that the gravel parking lots glittered with bits of broken glass from what I'm assuming were car windows. Sometimes there were really shifty people hanging around as well, or just driving around on the forest roads. These were some really rough roads too. You'd see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along roads meant for a 4x4. Some of these people you see in those cars, you can just tell at a glance that they're shady. All that being said, it was still my favorite place to camp. You just had to be a bit careful. A few years ago, 2 of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the national forest. Probably not legal. We decided to turn this paintball expedition into a full-on camping trip so we could play the next morning as well. After a pretty uneventful first day of shooting paintballs at one another, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up every spot in the area. This was really the only spot we were familiar with, and it was getting quite late at this point. We had to keep on looking for another. We drove about an hour further into the woods. By this time, it was really getting dark, and we were getting really worried about finding a new spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us could get any service. We turned off onto an unfamiliar road that was in very rough shape. In fact, it looked like the Forest Service Rangers had used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. It looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down at this point. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to just go over the mound. There was this old gravel road on the other side, pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few more miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood picnic table nailed to a tree. This was a pretty odd set piece. That being said, it was pretty much dark at this point. We couldn't keep driving around all night in the woods looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running and went to set up the tent. As we were doing so, I started to notice there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I could see a green bottle laying on the ground. Took a look at the label only to see it was a bottle of home and garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time. I thought someone must have been dumping their garbage out illegally here. None of us really thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area more than an hour away from the nearest home. We set up camp, grabbed some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was around 11 p.m. As we were eating, though, we noticed a faint glow coming from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles just didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving either. It was kind of like that glow you'd see when looking out over a bright city. We couldn't identify the source itself, though. Since there were no other access roads in the area, it couldn't be other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go and investigate this odd occurrence. Under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't have done so. However, we'd all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, so two of us, Jacob and I, decided we'd go take a quick look. My other friend Isaac decided to stay behind and pop some popcorn or something. We started walking toward the light source, and the situation got even stranger. As we looked on, all the trees in the area had their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. At first, we thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek or something. But that didn't make any sense. Why would a beaver go around all these trees and just knock the bark off in a circle? Jacob and I started talking about this ghost beaver in a pretty loud voice, probably due to our sheer drunkenness. As we were about to crest the top of the hill, Jacob tripped on a rock and shouted out, "Oh, ish!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other. Maybe we really didn't need to see what that light was after all. We walked back in silence, looking back over our shoulders every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlights as well, and just use the moonlight to get back. When we arrived within a couple 100 feet of the campsite, I could see Isaac walking in circles around it. He was wearing a hooded coat I hadn't seen him wearing before, and for some reason, he was now carrying his paintball gun in his hand. That seemed a bit odd. The fire had started to die down now, so we couldn't see anything else very well. At this point, we'd been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept on walking around the site, peering into the tent occasionally. Only, when we had almost arrived back, we saw Isaac walk up the road we'd come in on. We figured he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us or something. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for him to return. All of a sudden, we saw him lurch out of the tent instead. He stumbled a few feet forward and vomited. After we had left, he'd had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbled. Well, we asked him why he'd kept on wandering around the campsite with the paintball gun, and he got a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it or something? We went and checked, entered the door code, and saw all our paintball equipment just as we'd left it before. The keys to the truck were still hidden. I got a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing after we left? I was watching a movie on my phone and then I fell asleep, I guess. That was you walking around with your paintball gun just then, right? Isaac said he'd been in the tent ever since we'd left, and he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite searching, and it was not Isaac. At this point, all of us were way too drunk to drive, but we decided to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We didn't even bother packing up the tent. We just folded it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jumped in the F-150, and I started to drive out. When we got to the dirt hump, I could see something gray blocking our path back. The metal barrier that had been laying in the woods earlier was back on its stand, right on top of the hump earlier. By this point, all of us had sobered up to the situation. No one wanted to leave the car to move it out of the way. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drove forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. I guess it popped off with the force, and we drove over it slowly. We were terrified it would pop one of the tires as we drove over, but thankfully it didn't. As we continued to drive down the road, I could see a vehicle following us with its lights off, probably 1,000 feet behind us. I almost wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't kept catching glimpses of it as the moonlight reflected off. I started to drive as fast as I could on that forest road, and the other vehicle kept pace behind. It never got any closer though. It just stayed 1 or 2 turns behind us. We could only see it when the road straightened out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we made it back to the main paved road. I started to drive everyone back to my house, but I decided to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for a DUI somehow. Camping can be very fun, but rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place like it's supposed to be. I would never go down that road again at night though. I lived in Wisconsin and worked at a covert restaurant when I had this horrible experience. At the time, I had an old clunker for a car. It would get me to and from work, sure, but it was one of those cars that every time you drove it, you just knew something was eventually going to happen. You always just hoped that when it did, it was going to be nice outside at least. Of course, that's never how it actually works out. The day I finally had the problem with my car, it was definitely not a nice day. It had been snowing hard all day long, and the ride to work had been bad enough. This day just got worse and worse. While I was working the closing shift, I don't think the entire 9 hours I was at work the snow even slowed down once. It was just constant, even though the plows had been running all day long. They could only do so much before the roads just ended up covered once they left. We closed at 10 p.m. or so, and it took us another 45 minutes to clean up the store. There was one coworker and one manager with me. We locked up all the doors and then went our own ways. It felt quite good to get out of work finally. I knew it would feel even better to get home, but I was not looking forward to the journey there. I lived a good 10 miles away, and in these weather conditions that ride was going to take forever. I had only gotten about halfway there when the very worst thing happened. I blew a tire. I was panicked at first. I was worried I was going to wreck the car due to the lack of traction on the ice. Somehow though, I managed to pull into the parking lot of a nearby office building. Although I did have a spare, I didn't have a jack or anything to get the lug nuts off the tire apparently. Yeah, I know it's stupid, but I always thought I'd have the time to get those things if I ever needed them. Now I had no idea what I was going to do. There was no way I could just walk home, and I definitely couldn't leave my car here either. Even if I could call a taxi, if I left my car there it might get towed away, and I just could not afford a towing fee right now. I tried my best to get a hold of some friends, but nobody was answering their phone that day. I waited there in my car for a while, just watching the snow fall and wondering what I could do in this situation. I wasn't in the parking lot for more than 15 minutes when an SUV pulled off the road and drove over to me. I was immediately worried I was about to get in some trouble for idling in the parking lot, but I was also hopeful this was just someone trying to help me. A big, husky, bearish-looking man climbed out of this SUV and walked up to my car. He knocked gently on the window, and I rolled it down.
"Hey there, need some help changing a tire?" the burly man said.
"Yeah, I don't have any jacks or tools on me. I do have the tire, though," I explained to him. The man, as nice as could be, told me he had some tools and would be more than willing to help me change my tire. I'm not a particularly big guy myself, and I'd never had to do it before. This guy seemed thankfully genuinely willing to help me out. He went over to his SUV and got his tools. I thanked him profusely. As he began to change the tire, I got out of the car and stood behind him. I told him from now on I would get the tools, and if this ever happened again, I would be prepared from then on. While the man was explaining to me what to do, though, I caught something in the very corner of my eye. I didn't know what it was at first, but looking back towards that SUV, I saw the scariest thing I'd ever seen in my life. There was a person, bloodied up with duct tape over her mouth, trying to climb into the front of the car. Her hands were duct taped together as well, and her eyes were desperate for help. I was immediately scared to death. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't like I could fight this guy. He would tear me apart without even trying. I figured the only thing I could do was not let on that I just noticed her, and memorize his license plate number, call the police when he left. The rest of the tire change was just terrifying. I had no idea what that man was going to do with me. I didn't know if he was just trying to be helpful, or if he wanted to hurt me too. I tried my best not to look nervous, but every time he moved closer, I nearly jumped out of my skin. When he had finally changed the tire and began to lower the car back down, I reached into my pocket and grabbed my car keys. He picked up the jack and asked me to lean over and take a look. I really didn't want to do so, but I did it very slowly while making sure to keep an eye on him. When he saw how slowly I was moving, he picked up his tools and went over to put them in the back of his car. Immediately, I grabbed my keys out of my pocket, threw my door open, and slammed it shut. I looked in the mirror and saw the man had noticed me. He began to move quickly around the SUV. I turned on my own car. Thank God horror movie cliches don't happen in real life. My car started right away. I put it in gear and took off before the man could get to the side of my car. I pulled away, slipping more than once on the ice and almost sending my car spinning. Eventually, I did get away, and it was long before he had a chance to get into his SUV and follow me. I drove straight to the police station to tell them what I'd witnessed. While I was giving my statement, they sent the cars out to the parking lot. They found the girl still duct taped and nearly naked, lying frozen and covered in snow in the parking lot. The man must have figured he'd gotten caught and dumped her. He probably hadn't figured I'd had the time to memorize his plate numbers. I'm very happy to report the police found him as well. I testified at his trial, and he went to prison. The woman turned out to actually be his girlfriend. She was very convinced he wanted to kill her, and very thankful to me that my tire had gone out that night, and I'd called the police to come help. So when I was 19, I casually dated this guy named Casey that I'd met through a mutual friend. We hit it off the first time we met and hung out for hours. He was incredibly charming and we had quite a lot in common as well. I was definitely, even at the start though, getting an off vibe. The day after we hung out, my friend texted me. warning me not to get too involved with him because he was kind of a psycho. I ignored his warning, which is something I came to regret to this very day. My friend wouldn't elaborate though, no matter how many times I asked, so I shrugged it off as probably nothing that extreme. Surely he'd tell me if it was, right? Casey and I were by no means serious. He said he planned on seeing other girls, and didn't even want to call me his girlfriend. I appreciated his straightforwardness, though my feelings were very hurt by this. I told myself that maybe if we got closer he would change his mind, but as I spent more and more time with him, I began to see exactly what my friend had been talking about. He had some serious anger issues. He would do things like throw plates against the wall if something wasn't fully cooked in the microwave, and casually talk about how on bad days, he fantasized about going on a shooting spree and getting away with it. I finally broke up with him after he told me in a fit of rage that he wished he could shove a fire poker down the neighbor's dog's throat so it would never bark again. Altogether, our fling lasted less than 5 months. He kept on trying to convince me to date him again in the following months though. Obviously, I kept telling him no way. Eventually, I started dating my now husband. Casey made one last attempt to get me back by showing up at my apartment to tell me he was in love with me, and if he couldn't have me, then life was not worth living. He told me if I didn't let him in and try to work things out, he would shoot himself in the head. Since he had a gun on him, I was terrified of what he could do. I had no idea how to handle this situation, so I let him inside with the intention of keeping him as calm as I could. I texted one of his friends to come grab him and help him. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what happened after, but he kept on trying to kiss me, and when I made it clear we weren't going to be intimate, he beat the shit out of me. He left and left me bleeding and crying on the ground. I didn't tell my then boyfriend about this because I didn't want them to have an altercation. I made up excuses why I couldn't see him for weeks until all my marks had healed up. I had to tell my coworkers I was in a bike crash, but I could tell no one really believed that. Casey texted me apologizing, said he loved me so much that he'd snapped because he needed me. He tried to frame his violence as some kind of puffed up romantic gesture. I told him to never come near me again and threatened to call the cops as well. I was scared shitless for over a year that he would come back and attack me and kill me. After that incident though, I didn't hear from him again. Fast forward to 6 years later. At this point, my husband and I had married and just had our first kid. She was 5, and we were fostering her with the intention of adopting her. We lived in a new state several hours away. Somehow, that I really can't figure out, Casey figured out I had a daughter. He messaged me on Facebook, saying he knew I had a daughter, and she must be his. I tried to explain that she was not my biological child, but he insisted I was lying, and she looked exactly like him. She wasn't even the same race, by the way. He's white with blonde hair and blue eyes, and she's Hispanic. I told him he was crazy, blocked him, and deleted all my photos of her from Facebook. My account was completely private. I even double-checked all my settings and my links to make sure there was no access, so I have no clue how he even got that information. Another few weeks went by without contact. I was feeling quite confident that was the last I'd ever hear from him, but I was so wrong. He showed up at my house, begging to talk. He looked like a and had clearly developed a serious drug habit over the years, far beyond just weed from the old days. His face was so pale, and he had these dark rings around his eyes. He was so shaky. My husband wasn't there, so I was pretty terrified. He begged me to meet her. Once again, I emphasized she was not my biological child, and told him he needed to stay away from my family or I would call the police. He started on this whole unhinged tangent about how we belonged together, and it wasn't fair for me to keep punishing him for not realizing that sooner. He went on about how after he'd found out about her, God told him while he was on meth that he needed to quit everything and get clean so he could be with me and raise our daughter. I just slammed the door in his face and told him I was calling the cops. He shouted back I couldn't keep him away from this child forever. I called the police, and all they did was file a report. Told me there was nothing they could do unless he threatened or harmed one of us. Well, about 3 months later, one day, my daughter didn't come home on the bus like usual. I called the school, only for them to say she had been picked up by her dad. As you can imagine, the next few hours were complete and total hell on earth. My husband came home early from work, and we had to wait at the house with a cop and detective in case he took her home, while the other cops searched for them. The detective told me that from everything I'd told him, he didn't think he was at risk of harming her or fleeing with her. Luckily, he was right. They were found at a McDonald's, and he was arrested quickly, while my daughter was taken to the hospital. Thankfully, she hadn't been harmed physically. It was incredibly awkward to have to explain to a 5-year-old why a strange man she'd never met was telling her he was her dad. The prosecution was also insanely lenient on him due to his mental health issues and birth problem, coupled with the fact he hadn't harmed her. They ended up dropping all serious charges like kidnapping a minor and sentenced him to stay at a state hospital until he was deemed healthy enough to be let out, which ended up only being 4 months. They granted us a restraining order that lasted 2 years, but we were assured if he contacted any of us again, we would no doubt be able to get another one. It's 4 years later, and we haven't heard from him since. My daughter wasn't traumatized or anything, just saw it as a strange experience she had as a child. Me though? I still have intense anxiety every time the doorbell rings. My husband bought a shotgun immediately after this went down. I've heard through the grapevine that Casey has been mostly clean besides being an alcoholic now. It's an upgrade from meth at least, I guess. He seems to be less bat-ish insane. That's nice, but I really hope I never see that man again for the rest of my life. Why is it that when winter rolls around, it always seems to bring out the freaks, you know? I really hate it. When I was a senior in high school, I was a pizza delivery guy in a college town. For the most part, during winter break, business was really slow. During my second year delivering pizzas, though, I had the worst delivery experience ever. That night, I just so happened to be the only driver who was working. Well, on second thought, I guess maybe it wasn't quite that unusual. Most of the other drivers were college kids who would go home for breaks, so they wouldn't be around anyway. I was at work bored off my ass because there'd only been a few orders all day. Whilst I was hanging out and talking with the cashier, I actually became very grateful for this because a snowstorm was just starting to brew up. She was a very cute girl, and I'd been trying to put the moves on her for a while. Each time I'd come up short, though. I'd like to think I was making at least some progress when we got an order for a pizza finally. For many reasons, I was not happy about having to drive through pitch darkness in a snowstorm. It was really hard to see for one, and for two, I had to drive extremely slow. It was no surprise to me then that the pizza was to be delivered to a house far outside of town, mostly since there were no students on campus at this time. Even the trek to the house itself was slippery and dangerous. Luckily, I made it there just fine. It seemed to be an older 2-story house, with nothing very unusual about it. I pulled my car into the slippery driveway. I was a bit apprehensive at first. There seemed to be no lights on at all. I double-checked my GPS. Definitely the right house, though. I gathered up the pizza and the cookie pizza for dessert and hopped out of my car. I walked up the steps to the front porch, nearly slipping along the way. Just as I hit the second step, the porch light shot on, startling me with the suddenness. When I made it to the screen door, the regular door opened. A lady who looked to be in her 50s or so opened the door. She immediately looked alarmed and opened the screen door as well. "What are you doing here? Get in the house right now!" I wasn't about to go into a stranger's house. I have your pizza," I stammered in confusion, suddenly even more unhappy about this assignment. "I didn't order a made pizza. I can't believe this is happening. Get in here right now or you're gonna get killed." "Why?" I asked, confused and now more than a little bit scared. The woman hurried me into the house, and I went along with her. Once I was behind her and inside, she locked the door shut and bolted it several times. "What the hell is going on?" I asked. "Keep your voice down," the lady told me. "There's a guy outside who's been tormenting me and trying to get into my house. He cut my phone line and I haven't been able to call the police. He's been trying to get in and I've been terrified. He must have called for you to get me to open the door. He probably thought I couldn't just leave you out there to get killed." I thought the woman must be crazy, but then I started to hear noises. I looked over to the window by the porch, and what I saw made my blood run cold immediately. I could see a crazed-looking man on the porch right by the window, peeking in, tapping what looked to be the tip of a chef's knife against the glass. I had no idea how he could have gotten there so fast. Then I realized he must have been hiding somewhere at the same time I'd gotten there. "Holy shit!" I yelled, dropping the pizza and the cookie on the ground. As soon as I did, the man disappeared from view. I reached for my phone to call the police, but the old woman stopped me, telling me she had already tried and couldn't get a signal. She was trying to keep quiet in the house and didn't even want me trying to talk on the phone in case I alerted the man. "That's insane," I told her. "Don't you have a gun or something?" She told me she didn't keep one. I suggested we go into the kitchen together and grab some knives. She agreed this was a good idea. I followed the lady and we were there in a few seconds when I began to hear tapping on the window once more. I turned and looked over to the kitchen window, only to see the man there again, tapping his knife on the windowsill before disappearing out of view once more. I ran over to the knife block, and that's when I noticed something. The woman's chef knife was not in her knife block. I mentioned this to her, and the woman's entire demeanor instantly changed. "Well, that's because my husband has it. He'll be coming into the house now." The door in the kitchen then opened. I realized not only had it not been locked, it had been a setup from the very start. The crazed-looking man, who I realized must be this woman's husband, walked into the house. I reacted totally on instinct. I was still at the knife block, so I grabbed it. I didn't really have time to take out the other knives, so I simply picked the whole block up and threw it at both of them. I ran towards them and knocked the old man over while I made my way to the back door. I ran around the side of the house and momentarily slid on a patch of ice and fell down. I did manage to get back up quickly, but the moment I did, I saw the front porch light come on and the old man come shooting out. As I began to run, I saw the old woman coming at me from behind, so I took off. It was so slippery that I slipped again when I got to my car. I slammed my head against the window. Still though, I managed to open the car before either of them were able to get their hands on me. The crazy old man even tried to bust my car window by stabbing it with his knife. Luckily, my window was more than a match for his puny arms and did not shatter. I put the car in reverse and backed it out of the driveway. I would like to tell you that as I pulled out, I changed my mind and ran the car back into those two old shits, but I didn't. I just wanted to get the hell out of there and call the cops. When the cops investigated, it was much worse than I could have ever imagined. The couple who attacked me did not live in that house, as you might have guessed. In fact, they had broken in and even murdered the older woman who actually lived there. They were obviously going to try and kill me too. They hightailed it before the cops arrived. I have PTSD from the experience. I had to quit my job at the pizza place and just got myself a work-study job. I went off to college in a different state, and I don't come back home for the holidays now. When I was 12 years old, my dad got a really good new job, and we found a new house in a really nice area of town. It was the first time we'd ever moved, so it was a bit of an adjustment for me, even though it was in the same town. I didn't even have to change schools. One thing that helped was that I really liked the house. It was a brick building that had 3 floors and an attic. It was also enormous and obviously very old. The doors to all the rooms were wooden and had actual keyholes as well. I had never actually seen a door with a natural keyhole, except in cartoons. The floors were old hardwood that creaked when they were walked upon. It was like nothing I'd experienced before. It didn't take long for me to want to explore the entire house. It had a lot of extra rooms, and my mom had plans on using them for various things. A study, a sewing room. She even had a library, which was really cool because I loved books. A few months after we'd settled into the house, while we were eating dinner one night, my older brother said something really interesting. He told my mom there was an old woman up in the attic. "Stop trying to scare your little brother," my mom told him. He insisted he wasn't trying to scare anyone though. My mom really didn't believe him because he was always trying to pull scary pranks on me. When my brother continued to insist, my dad put his foot down and told him to stop. My brother would never defy my father, so he did stop. I could tell he was very displeased though. The following day, my brother got home from school the same time I did. Both of our parents were at work, so we were at home all alone. When I was in my bedroom changing out of my school clothes, my brother came to talk to me. He told me he hadn't been trying to scare me the previous night. He was really telling the truth. I assured him I believed him, even though I really didn't. He asked me if I wanted to go up into the attic with him and see the old woman then. I declined, telling him I had a lot of homework to do. He proceeded to tease me as big brothers tend to do, calling me a chicken and such. Eventually, I did give in, and he and I went on our way. The entrance up to the attic was on the 3rd floor of the house. It was this steep staircase that led up to an old door. I had been there a few times as we'd moved in, and really never had a problem with it. I did understand though how it could seem scary. I just always thought it was cool as the rest of the house was though. Being with my brother and knowing he was going to try and scare me when we got to the door, it did look a little bit foreboding now. My brother was walking in front of me, so I thought for a moment that he must have been sincere and not trying to scare me. If he was trying to frighten me, surely it would make more sense to just walk behind me and grab me at an opportune moment. He opened up the door, and the two of us walked into the attic together, with him going first again. The attic itself was a bit ominous. It was a large area that didn't have any drywall up, just a lot of bare insulation. It was huge and full of all sorts of things my parents had put up there, and some others from before as well. My brother pointed to a Christmas tree sitting in the corner of the room. Must have been left over from the previous owners, I assumed. He was pointing towards the tree because that's where he had seen this old woman. Despite the fact I was expecting him to scare me, something like a jump scare, I leaned forward and squinted to get a closer look. While I was looking, I heard the attic door slam shut behind me. Angry I'd fallen for the trick, I turned around, only to see my brother standing far away from the door, real fear in his eyes. He was looking over in that direction, so I turned around and looked too. Standing behind the tree, looking at us through the branches, was what looked like an old woman, peering at me. I began to back away towards the door, even though I knew this was not going to do me any good. As I did, I saw the woman reach forward and with her scrawny, bony hands, move the branches to the side. She reached out with the other and beckoned me to come closer. She opened her mouth, and I could see maggots wriggling around on her gums. She made this awful moaning noise. I'm not proud to tell you I screamed like Jamie Lee Curtis and ran to the door. Although it had slammed shut, I was happy to know that the horror movie cliché of a slammed door becoming inexplicably locked did not apply here. I opened that door and grabbed my brother to sprint out of that attic. I told my parents what happened later, but they never believed me. They thought it was my brother's taunting that had influenced my imagination. As far as I'm aware, neither of them experienced it. I've had to go back into the attic at later points in my life, but I never saw that woman again. I'll never forget that image though, and neither will my brother. In May of 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto and were stuck living together after the breakup, as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and very upsetting. When a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping and fishing trip, I jumped at the chance to leave. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful. Loads of lush forest, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a particular creek named Grindstone Creek. It was close to a wetland area, and the fishing was supposed to be really good. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field, guessing it was trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the shit, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. It was a pretty good and fun night, actually. We turned in just after midnight and shared the tent together. My buddy fell asleep before me. I stayed up playing on my phone until around 1:30 or so. I must have drifted off at some point, because next thing I remember, I was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping type noise. I was kind of groggy still, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant and sounded like a weird coyote or something. I laid there for a moment listening, then started playing on my phone again. That noise was annoying as hell. I tried my very best to ignore it, but it sounded like it was getting a lot closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet away. At this point, I became very unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a small dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food and brought its buddies? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I was very prone to worrying about these types of thoughts. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, only to see that the noise had woken him up too. We discussed about what we would do to this coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not a BB gun, nothing really. Finally, he decided he would just shine the flashlight at it and holler quite a lot, hopefully scaring the animal off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him point the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. He peeked his head out. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards in shock. He had this dumbfounded look on his face and started to babble. "It's not a coyote, it's a dude out there. Some weird dude." Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and scare easily, so that was the type of thing he would do. But I had never seen someone look so genuinely scared. I never want to see that expression on someone's face again either. I knew he couldn't be pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling noises were still going on. In retrospect, it didn't really sound like a coyote. I guess in our groggy states, it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. My friend kept on telling me to take a look and make sure he was not going crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing. I felt like but I had to look. I slowly peeked out of the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust. And that's when I saw him. A man, standing only a few arms lengths away from the tent. He was swaying back and forth, wearing a baseball cap. What made it really awful, though, what was really creepy, was that he was only wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. I pulled my head back inside the tent, and my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy. My buddy started yelling first. "Hey dude, can you fuck off? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped. It was dead silent. We heard the footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside. We didn't waste any time. We started yelling again. "Seriously, fuck off. We have cell phones in here. If you don't fuck off, we're gonna call the Rangers." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off, moving towards the road, it sounded like. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified until the first sign of sunlight. Then we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and were both pretty embarrassed about how we'd handled the situation. Definitely not handling it the best on either of our parts. I think we're both ashamed because of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much. We haven't really ever talked about it since that day. I always wonder just what the hell that guy was doing out there, and what the hell was wrong with him either. I wonder if things would have turned out differently if we were a couple of girls instead of two guys. I'm not saying he was a serial killer or something, but it seemed like he was testing us when we were in the tent. I guess I'll never know, and for that, I'm kind of glad. This happened in my hometown when I was 7. I'm 36 now. For context, I lived on an island just off the coast of Washington State, in a military town that's among one of the safest places to live in all of the US. Still though, I suppose weirdos are everywhere. Timing is vague for me, but since I was outside playing with my friends, I guess it was likely a summer evening just before dinner time. We were screwing around riding our bikes in the street, running around and doing the usual kid stuff, when a car pulled up and stopped right across the middle of the street. I don't remember exactly what the man driving it said, but he must have beckoned me over, because next thing I know, I had walked close enough to hear more. The man asked me if I had seen other kids wandering around this place, because his kids were missing. I noticed that there was also a woman in the car with him. I assumed she must be the mom if he was the dad. I told him I hadn't seen them wandering around, but there was a park nearby around the corner, and he might be able to find them there. The man asked if I would be willing to get in his car and show them where this park was. Although I didn't understand just how dangerous this was, I was well aware of the whole stranger danger thing, so of course I said no. The man asked again if I would please get in the car and help him find his children at this park. I told him no once more. I couldn't do that. I did give him directions though, and skipped off to continue playing with my friends, who were standing there watching the whole time. The man just drove away. A few minutes later, my mom came outside to call me in for dinner. I bounced happily up the driveway to tell her I just helped someone out. I was very proud and excited to have helped out an adult. I explained the whole situation to her. I could see her face change, but she just nervously said, "That's very nice of you, hon." I felt a surge of pride within me. When my dad came home, my mom obviously told him what had happened. His reaction was much different. He told me although he was proud I liked to help people, I was never ever to approach anyone I didn't know like that again. Adults should never be asking children for help. He told me I was very lucky I hadn't gotten snatched, and to always remember it, because they would have lost me forever if things had gone badly. He was very stern, which did hurt my ego a bit, and I lost a tiny bit of innocence that day. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.